Hi, everyone. Welcome to San Francisco Public Library's Zoom channel. I'm going to give it a few minutes to let all our participants get in the room before we start talking. Okay, I'm just going to start with some introductions. Welcome, everyone, again. I'm Michelle Jeffers with San Francisco Public Library, and you're here tonight for Grotto Nights at the library with tonight's theme, writing about marriage. What's love got to do with it? Before we get started, let me begin with a land acknowledgement. San Francisco Public Library acknowledges that we occupy the unceded ancestral homeland of the Ramaytush Ohlone people, who are the original inhabitants of the San Francisco Peninsula. We recognize that we benefit from living and working on their traditional homeland. As uninvited guests, we affirm their sovereign rights as First Peoples, and we wish to pay our respects to the ancestors, elders, and relatives of this community. Please fill in the chat if you'd like to tell us what native land you're calling in from today. And before we get started, I also want to just do a shout out to our next month's Grotto Night. You're going to have such a great time tonight. You're going to want to come back. Next month, we'll be talking about writing children's books, exploring different paths with Grotto writers Lisa Lerner, Britta Stonemeyer, and Stephanie Wildman. Now, let me introduce you to our Grottoans for tonight. We have Audrey Ferber here, whose essays and stories have appeared in the New York Times, Lilith Magazine, First Person Singular, New World Writing, the Cimarron Review, Best Women's Travel Writing, and elsewhere. She's at work on a collection of essays about marriage and caretaking, and she teaches at the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute and at the Grotto. Sabina Khan-Ibarra is a writer, poet, and teacher. She's currently focused on completing her chapbook, New Vocabulary, and her novel, The Poppy Flower. Her work has been featured in various journals and anthologies, including Non-White and Women, Taboos, and Transgressions. She is a member of the Grotto and currently works as the director for Rooted and Written, the only tuition-free writers conference. She was formerly the communications director at Muslim Anti-Racism Collaborative, and she continues to be involved as a member. Sabina has also taught creative writing at SF State. Go Gators. Eleanor Vincent's new memoir, Disconnected, Portrait of a Neurodiverse Marriage, is forthcoming from Vine Leaves Press. It tells the story of her gradual discovery that her husband was on the autism spectrum and how she tried to survive a loveless marriage. Her debut memoir, Swimming with Maya, A Mother's Story, poignantly describes the death of her 19-year-old daughter in a horse riding accident and the subsequent donation of Maya's organs to strangers in need. It is a New York Times ebook bestseller and was nominated for the Independent Publisher of the Year award. Her essays have been published in several collections, including Creative Nonfiction's anthology, At the End of Life, and This, I Believe, on Motherhood. And then we also have Sophia Raday, who is going to be our moderator tonight as well. She's working on a mystery featuring a group of women cops going through Middlesex in the Bay Area. In the meantime, she celebrates the joy and power of women of experience through her SheFlex social media accounts. Her book, Love in Condition Yellow, A Memoir of an Unlikely Marriage, was selected for the American Bookseller Association's Indie Next list and is an indie hardcover favorite. Her work has appeared in the New York Times, Slate, and Politico, among others. Tonight, we'll start with discussions by all our writers, and then we'll go to question and answer a little bit after 7. You can use the chat to submit your questions, or you can use the Q&A function on Zoom. I'll let our writers take it over from here. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Michelle. Hi, everyone. I'm Sophia Raday. I'm a member of the Writers Grotto, and I'll be your moderator tonight. First, let me just introduce the Grotto for those of you that don't know about it. We are a group of working writers and narrative artists who connect in physical and virtual space, pooling our talents to support each other, mentor and teach others, and to engage the wider world. We try to foster a literary community and culture that is generous in spirit and deeply inclusive, elevating writers of all backgrounds. We have classes and programs for all kinds of writers and literary citizens. So please check out our website and sign up for our newsletter, follow us on socials if you'd like to learn about our ever-changing roster of classes and events. We think there's something for everybody. So now to tonight's topic, writing about marriage. Marriage is, of course, an age-old institution. It's been around a long time. which means it carries a lot of social and cultural baggage, while at the same time, like so many things related to women, has often been portrayed through trope and stereotype, or hidden and obscured behind idealization. The way this happens is, of course, different in every culture. In European culture, one way is through that typical fairy tale ending, and they lived happily ever after, which suggests that after the wedding, nothing interesting ever happens. Of course, that's patently false. And the work of this group of writers tonight illuminates and brings more honesty to marriage's complexity, particularly from women's perspectives, and showing more of its frustrations and challenges, as well as its depth and beauty. So we'll start tonight by introducing ourselves, explain the point of view we bring to our writing on marriage, and each of the panelists, Audrey, Sabina, and Eleanor, will also do a quick reading to give you a flavor of their writing. Then we'll have a conversation about what it's like to take on this topic, how to balance honesty and authentic revelation with privacy, how the spouses or the real life inspiration behind fiction responded to the writing or chided us in our heads, how to move from therapeutic writing to well-crafted work, the pros and cons of different genres, and many other interesting things. Like Michelle said, we also want to hear from you. There will be time at the end to hear audience comments and answer questions, so please feel free to write them in the chat or the Q&A. So the reason I got the moderator job was because I wrote a memoir, as Michelle mentioned, Love and Condition Yellow. Let's see if I can know if this will work. There it is. About my courtship and marriage to someone who was in many ways my political opposite. This is rather apropos right now as the election comes. When I met my partner, I was a Democrat, former peace activist who was fond of yoga, and he was a Republican police officer fond of firearms. My memoir is a very personal story, but through the personal story, I was trying to show that it is possible to overcome those differences. If I could sum up what I'd love people to get from my book is that it's that underneath conversation about politics, there is something else going on, a way in which we are unconsciously mapping our unique perspective with all its trauma and triumph onto political issues. And what this means is that if we can get down to that deeper level as individuals to individuals, we can reach something very human where differences soften, connection can happen, and bridges can be built. It's not easy, though. It takes a lot of energy and time, but my husband and I have almost 29 years to show for it. So now let's hear from our other panelists about their work related to marriage. Eleanor, would you like to start?
Sure. Thank you, Sophia. And thanks to the library for hosting us. I guess what I would say about my latest book is that it started as one kind of book and evolved as the marriage evolved. When I originally started what was going to become Disconnected, it was called Better Late. And I was going to do a sort of aren't we cute, sort of opposite personality types, getting together late in life, inspirational memoir. And as COVID happened and the shutdown happened and my marriage started to unravel, the book started to shift. So I wrote my way through this as my marriage was unraveling. And it took me a while to understand what was actually happening. I had suspected that my husband was a high-functioning autistic person, but he had never been diagnosed, and I was completely at sea. I didn't know how to handle this at all. And so I immediately began researching. We went through 3 rounds of marital therapy, which I later learned, but through both my own experience and through reading, is not a good approach for neurodiverse couples. It often makes things worse. And so finally, when I did find a certified autistic coach as a resource, it was a bit late, and my husband was not really willing to engage. So I'm going to read an excerpt from the first chapter of my book. Lars took me in his arms at a respectful distance, but with a confident frame. I relaxed. I closed my eyes and surrendered to the rhythm as we waltzed counterclockwise in a large circle. In time, the movement of the other couples became hypnotic as people dipped and turned and moved into open position like ice skaters. When the music ended, Lars bowed his head, kissed my hand, and returned me to the table where I had been sitting. "May I call you sometime?" I nodded. He handed me a business card. "Helping computers play nice with people for 25 years, I read at the bottom. At the end of the evening, I went to collect my jacket. I was so hot and sweaty from dancing, I worried I'd catch cold, so I wound a scarf around my neck. Suddenly, Lars appeared in the cloakroom. "Can I walk you to your car?" "I'll be fine. Thanks, though," I said, grateful for his offer. Alone in the stairwell of the darkened parking garage, I felt a pang. Should I have accepted? Was it possible to be too independent or overly standoffish with men? Zydeco dancing had become a safer way to be held and rocked without the illusions of romance or the risk of rejection. But dating? I decided that if Lars did ask me out, I'd take it slow. I'd pay attention. I'd make good and sure he had the makings of a reliable partner before I got involved. Years later, after our marriage was foundering, I attempted a last-ditch effort to save it. I suggested to Lars that we meet with a certified autism coach to see if we could untangle our warring neurotypes and learn how to communicate without triggering each other. Barbara held one meeting with us to assess our issues. We filled out a raft of forms to dig deeper into our dynamics. Then she set up individual meetings with each of us. She would not work with us as a couple until she got to know us as individuals. During our meetings, she drilled me on boundaries, detachment, and self-care. I read dozens of articles and book chapters she assigned. I completed the written homework. I tried harder. "You are dancing with a coat rack," she said in one of our sessions, reminding me of a classic Fred Astaire movie where he grabs a metal coat rack and proceeds to dance with it. "Yes," I said, "but I still love him." I knew what she meant, though. There was a pause before she spoke again. "You will always have to lead. He will always drag his feet." Odd, I thought, because he's such a damn fine dancer. Later, despite my pleas, Lars refused to do the homework or continue to meet with Barbara. We were at an impasse. She said she could not coach us as a couple because, she told me, I don't really know Lars at all. I felt like saying, I don't know him either. He's not the same man I married. Instead, I told her I was sorry we wouldn't be able to continue to work with her. I had to face the truth. I couldn't save our marriage alone. It would take many more months and an extended 6-week stay in Europe by myself before I summoned the courage to step out on my own.
Beautiful. That's really nice. And moving. I don't know. Maybe nice isn't quite right. It was very moving, Eleanor.
Thank you. Thank you, Sophia.
Sabina, would you like to go next?
Yes. Thank you. Thank you to the San Francisco Public Library. Thank you, Sophia, for organizing this. So the piece I'm reading today is a story. It's a fictionalized story of my parents. It's a magical realism version of their story. The lens changes, but right now my focus is romanticized since my father's diagnosis, cancer diagnosis, and my mother's response to it. So it's called Fairy Tale. She stood near the sliding doors that connected the family room to the backyard, at the brink of heaven he had created for her. Hues of green filled her vision, and in the center of it all, surrounded by a halo of leaves and a sparkling of blue and orange butterflies, her husband pruned a tree, standing on the concrete portion of the backyard. He leaned forward on his walker, unsteady. They were both getting old, bones stiffening and aching, but he was given a walker well before she thought he would need it. She willed his legs to be sturdy enough to venture onto the uneven dirt. It had been months since he had gotten on his knees to turn the soil and pull the nutrient-sucking weeds near his darling fruit trees. It had been even longer since he was able to reach for the topmost fruit on the trees with no trouble at all. He wobbled. He tripped but stopped himself from falling by gripping the walker and leaning back. Without moving the rest of her body, she reflexively lifted her arm as if to hold him up. Your old man almost broke his hip, he roared in Pashto, laughing. She didn't laugh. Was there anything she could do to turn back time? The lemon trees were heavy with ripe fruit. She spied the perfect one, a round, pregnant center, ellipsoid in shape. The skin was a bright yellow, not the aged yellow that was almost orange, but the yellow that comes right after the last of the green succumbs to ripeness. When she was younger, her husband would walk into the jungle of trees, pick the lemons, and squeeze lemonade. He always gave her the first sip, the fruit of his hard work. He'd watch her swallow the drink, eyes half closed, quenched, a simper on her lips. She'd shut her eyes so she couldn't see him. You are contentment, he'd say. Oh, you, she'd say coyly. He beamed. They both knew he meant the same to her. Now she would have thriving trees, even if he wasn't there, he had promised her. She could make her own lemonade anytime she wanted. She put her hands on her face and sobbed at the memories. Their early years together, the small joys and struggles. The way he used to surprise her with flowers picked from their garden, how they had built their forever together. 4 decades before, in a small village in Pakistan, she, the young bride, emerged from the cube-shaped ornate dole. Her heart slipped from the top of her throat to the tips of her toes and onto the floor, becoming an excited and anxious puddle. She shuffled her feet, softly tapping them to regain her composure. She was a butterfly in her sequined, sage-colored wedding dress, leaving the chrysalis stretching out her wings, the sun glistening off her being. In her new home, in the large courtyard, was a garden with many trees and bushes, guava, pomegranate, red apples, green limes. Her husband stood next to a pink rose bush at the edge of the garden. The fresh colors and smells welcomed her and made her feel less alone. Enveloped in a chiffon sadar, her face remained hidden, a silent observer of him. He was tall and handsome, wearing dark sunglasses like in the movies. She had only seen him in pictures. He was taller than she had thought. Standing together later, the threshold of their room, framing their union, his empty hands caught her eye. Her mother had told her that the piece of jewelry that the husband gives to his wife in private after seeing her face for the first time was a true sign of how much a husband adored his wife. It foretold the measure of love a husband would lavish upon his wife throughout their lifetime together. After she removed her veil in their room, he spoke softly, telling her that her beauty stopped his breath. She waited for him to present her with the traditional wedding gift. He revealed that he had nothing to offer. I wish I had some jewelry to give you, but I have none. She ducked her head so he couldn't see her eyes, where her disappointment sat bare. She was ashamed at her reaction, even if it was fleeting. She hoped what he saw was a bashful bride. A wife who disappoints her husband is cursed, her mother warned. In one ear and out the other, a marriage full of adoration and forgiveness is magic. One day, when we go to America, he said, I will honor you with many jewels, shiny and bright. Meeting his eyes, she nodded. She would spend the rest of her life with this man in whose eyes she saw truth cradled in sincerity. And that's it for now. Thank you.
There's many lovely images. And I think it will be interesting to talk in our discussion about fairy tales and sort of how we are using them or responding to them. And very, very nice, Sabina. Audrey, can we hear from you?
Sure. It's so wonderful to be here. I'm a great lover of the San Francisco Public Library. My story is when I was 36, I'm now 75. I don't know how that happened. I married a man who was 16 and a half years my senior. And for the first 10 or 15 years of our marriage, things kind of proceeded in a lovely forward motion. And my writing sort of presented or was the way I wanted it to be. I would jump from form to form. I wrote a play. I wrote stories on many topics. Some of them were very imaginative and sort of fantasies. But in the last 10 years, as my husband's health has greatly, greatly worsened, I find that caretaking has become a very big part of my life, as have his many medical problems. I find that those topics have almost completely taken over my writing. Almost everything I write is about aging, caretaking, and the particular situation of our marriage. Sometimes I ask myself, why not use my writing as an opportunity to escape and create beautiful fantasy worlds and dream worlds and cast myself as a younger character in perfect shape, but somehow it just doesn't happen. I feel an urgency to write about what I'm thinking about. Sometimes I still do cast the material in the short story form. More often lately, I've been casting it as nonfiction in the personal essay form. And once in a while, I do still cast things in the future, sort of as speculative caretaking stories. But I do feel very bound to writing about what I'm going through. And I think as I age and don't have as much time left as I did at one time, I think I want to write them in the essay form because it seems most urgent and most closest to recording what I'm going through at the moment. So I'll read you just a couple of pages of an essay of mine called Cleaning Instructions that was published a couple of months ago. Yeah, well, I can't remember when it was published, maybe around a year ago, in a wonderful column called First Person Singular. So this is Cleaning Instructions. I hate vacuuming. The smell of heated dust, the low roar as dead skin cells, mites, food bits escape and mist around me. I hate the machine's heavy body and the retractable cord that snaps out of the wall and whips my ankles. When I change the bag, I turn the canister on its side, on its bottom, on its other side, until the release valve pops open and spews gray fur dirt onto my bedroom rug. After my husband Jerry's fourth amputation, the removal of infected bone from his foot, he returned from the hospital attached to a vacuum. His wound vac pumps blood, fluid, and infection from the deep hole on the side of his foot through clear plastic tubing to a see-through collection canister. It's more than I can bear. While we eat, read the newspaper, watch TV, the machine sits on his lap or hangs on the arm of his wheelchair, gurgling, beeping, refusing to let me forget for even a second the mess of illness and old age. I can't do this anymore, I say to myself. My mantra, my contra, the same thing I said when he first needed a wheelchair, when he first became incontinent. When we married, I was 36 and Jerry a vital, seemingly healthy 52. Before our first anniversary, he needed an angioplasty. 35 years later, we've been together through more heart stents, femoral artery stents, a rare salmonella infection that lodged in his groin, spine surgeries, hand surgeries, sinus surgery, and the repeated foot wounds and amputations resulting from his diabetes. His hands are clawed by nerve damage, making it difficult for him to hold utensils, and vascular dementia limits his ability to understand his condition or make decisions about his care. For the first 2 months, he's attached to the VAC. A wound care nurse comes to the house 3 times a week to change his dressings and switch out the collection canister. "Can we get a new one today?" I asked the nurse, turning away from the see-through container, its sides coated with pus and blood, what the instruction manual refers to as exudate. "Medicare pays for 1 a week. Yours isn't full yet." She snaps off her nitrile gloves. I sigh. "Okay, I'll look in my car. Maybe I can find you one." I follow her out to the street. Our next door neighbor, Mr. Kim, waves hello. We've been renting this house for the 2 years since Jerry's illness forced us to sell the big house we'd lived in for 35. Goodbye, Moroccan tile, green paneled library, wolf range, panoramic views. COVID began just a few months after we moved, and the few conversations I've had with Mr. Kim have been muted through masks. I wonder what he thinks of the frequent ambulances. I wonder if he knows that I'm 16 and a half years younger than my husband, that I miss salsa dancing, that I want to go to Barcelona, or if he just sees me as part of the old couple who lives next door. Thank you.
Beautiful, Audrey. I think it's so important to illuminate this kind of experience. I'm sure you're not alone, but I don't know that there's that much talk about it. And there needs to be. So thank you. Well, let's have a conversation. So these bring up so many different thoughts for me, but maybe to start, we could talk about, you alluded a little bit, Audrey, to the choice of genre, and why did you each choose the genre that you did? And what are the challenges of writing about people or being inspired by personal relationships? And how does that intersect with like the genre you chose?
You know, I'll start if that's okay. I think when I first started writing about our marriage, once Jerry was pretty sick, when I started, I wasn't sure how much I wanted to reveal. I wasn't sure how much I wanted my life out there in the world. I wasn't sure how much Jerry would want his life out there in the world. And I felt protective of him and of myself. But as time goes on, I kind of feel like, I don't know if I have the energy to write it as a story, convert the truth into a story. And I think I used the word urgent before. It all feels very urgent for me right now. So that's how I've ended up mainly writing essays now.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. Eleanor and Sabina, thoughts?
Well, I think for me, telling stories that are based on my interpretation of reality or how I make sense of the world. And when unexpected or difficult things happen, it's my first impulse to start writing about it. And so it just naturally evolves that this is the work, this is what I'm doing. And I think it's so important. There's something about personal essay and memoir that I find very compelling. And I keep going back to Audrey's word, urgent. When I have something very urgent to say, I really want to have a contract with the reader that, yeah, this actually happened. It's my interpretation. I don't claim that it's the truth, but it is my interpretation of actual events. And, I started my career as a journalist, and I don't think that impulse has ever left me. I want you to know how, why, what, who, I want that lead graph that kind of takes you into the story. And yet I want to be able to use the techniques of a novelist. I want to be able to use dialogue and scene and have a narrative arc that's compelling and use metaphors and similes. So for me, creative nonfiction is the way. And with this particular book, I didn't really feel like I had a choice. I was so perplexed. I was just so perplexed when this person that I was in love with and had married very late in my life, I was 71 when I married my husband. It was my third marriage, and I'd been single for 35 years prior to that.
Wow.
So it was a huge adjustment, and clearly not an adjustment I would have been willing to make if I didn't think it was going to last, if I didn't think that this was my
No.
person.
Yeah.
And it was just so shocking when within months of the marriage, it seemed as if everything changed. And I really, really couldn't wrap my head around it.
Right.
And so writing about it was my survival, honestly.
Yeah, that makes sense. I'll just share super quickly that my memoir came out like 15 years ago now. It was pretty early. It reflects early time in my marriage. And I'm thinking too about the urgency. And I think there was something I was really struggling with, which in a way was, can I make this marriage work? And there was a lot of, I don't know, there was a lot of juice there, a lot of energy. And that's why I also felt like I wanted to write. I was grappling with it myself. I was writing to make sense of it. And I wanted to share what I was learning and coming up with. And now I am writing fiction. And I've kind of switched now. And I think I'm dealing with, the things I happen to be dealing with or thinking about is like the ridiculous idea that women, as they get older, become not very interesting or and less dynamic and et cetera, et cetera. So I'm writing against that. I'm writing to blow that up if I can. So Sabina, you're the fiction writer of the three. Do you want to say anything about your choice of fiction, and what freedoms that gave you, and why?
Yeah, of course. So I've written creative nonfiction, and this particular story started off as actually a creative nonfiction, but it was just I felt like it was too close, and I needed the distance from what was happening in order to see more and to write tell a better story. It also it gave me more freedom because I could blend truth and imagination. For me, what was happening was so intense with my parents, my father's progression. And, my dad's 74, my mom's 70. And so they're not very old. All of this is happening because of this illness, how they're aging so fast. And so all of these things were a lot for me personally, process, but then taking it to a fiction place actually helped me write the story that I wanted to tell, how I envisioned their marriage and how I envisioned the outcome of what is happening. And so for me, that was really helpful. I feel like when you're writing creative nonfiction, sometimes for me, particularly in this situation, and I've written so before my parents' illness, I had a son who passed away, and I would write a lot of creative nonfiction regarding that. But when you're too close to a subject or to a moment, I think for me, maybe other people can write amazing things, but it's too raw for me to tell the story. I'm just kind of almost cataloging events and not telling a story. And so I wanted to kind of tell a story, and that's why I chose to do this with this story of my parents.
Right. And for the audience, Sabina's piece is a work in progress, correct? And not published yet, but
Right.
I had the privilege of reading the whole thing, and it's really beautiful. And I can see how fiction allowed you more creativity and, just a little less constraints. So,
Sophia, one thing that worries me about my own writing sometimes is in this urgent kind of blurting out, what I'm feeling and what I'm going through. Sometimes I wonder if it's therapy or art. And when I was in graduate school or, studying writing in college quite a while ago, but there was a big movement of saying, for my particular teachers, writing's not supposed to be therapy. Writing is art, work it out on your own time and then make it into art. Sometimes I don't know. I wonder how the rest of you feel about it. I mean, it just kind of worries me sometimes that it's like,
Just a quick question. Were these mostly men by any chance?
not really. No,
Oh, really?
I
Okay.
went to Mills, so
Oh, well,
on
yeah.
Mills. No,
Yeah.
I can't blame it on them being men. But this is maybe when I was an undergraduate at SF State too, taking writing classes. That just seemed to be what people were saying. Writing is not therapy. I don't know.
I mean, I think I'm curious what the others think. Like, I think something has to have juice. A topic has to have juice for you in order for it to be, be imbued with passion and I don't know, life. But there might be something different between, say you're very upset about something and you're ranting on a page, just sort of, vomiting onto the page. That's probably, not art yet, but I think it's something that could be shaped into art. What do other people think?
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to say. I think that a lot of writers will say that writing is therapy. Not sometimes you're not writing about the event that happened, but just writing is a way that we can, we feel better after writing. But writing about these things is therapeutic. But like Sophia said, I think you have to let it marinate, and then sculpt later, and make it into something more thoughtful and intentional, using craft techniques, and make that into a piece of work that maybe you can consider a creative piece versus just writing a piece for therapy. But they can be both. And for me, most of my writing it has been a form of therapy, actually.
Very helpful.
Yeah, I would agree with that, and I don't see a problem with that. I see a problem if the writer doesn't take the time and use the craft skills to then take that work and turn it into a story that is really going to be engaging to readers. So there's a process involved. It's like, I don't know, bread rising or something. You don't call it bread when you've just kneaded it and slapped it down on the board. That's the first draft, okay? But
Right.
then there's all the working of it, and you wrap it in plastic wrap and you stick it in the fridge, or you marinate on it, as we were saying. And it's a process and it takes time. But hopefully the end result is something beautiful and separate from the writer. Even in a work of creative nonfiction, I try to create separation. There is a difference between me as a narrator and me as the writer, and then me as the character in the story. So that requires a good deal of teasing out the various points of view and the development, the character arc of not only myself, but in the case of this new book, of my estranged husband. So yeah, no, I think it requires a lot of work, a lot of kneading, a lot of rolling it out over and over again.
Right. I agree.
So this kind of brings up for me, like, I think that I agree with everything you said, Eleanor, and everybody said, and I do think that revelation and being deeply honest is part of the power of memoir. And I think if you're going to write a memoir, it's important to be pretty open and honest about tough things. And I'm wondering about how you guys dealt with that, and if that intersected with any privacy concerns. Yeah, I'm curious about that. For me, I had to get I had to get an okay from my husband before I felt comfortable writing the memoir that I did, which was a beautiful gift because he's not a guy that wants a lot of attention from the public. So how have you all dealt with privacy issues? Wondering how the people that are inspiring your writing, say in the case of Sabina, might feel about how you're writing about them.
So for me, it's actually hard because in my culture, which is Pashtun, it's northern Pakistan, eastern Afghanistan. Cancer is considered almost a bad word. You don't say it. You try to. It's not denial, but there's like you just don't say it. So for me to write this piece, I had to.
Yeah.
I think that's another reason that fictionalizing it was good for me, because I can talk about these characters, and like trying to honor their story, be true to their story, and without like hurting them, trying not to exploit their story as my own, but also being honest. So it's really hard for me because I think all of you guys write about your own stories. And for me, that was it's a really hard. I didn't really get the permission. I don't know how they feel, but I think the way that I did it, I put enough fiction in it for them to be okay with it. And I think also that this is written with a lot of love for them, and I think that love shines through. And so I'm hoping that they're okay with it. But yeah, it's a tightrope between truth and protection.
Wow, that's well put. Yeah, I think the love does shine through. As a person who got to read the whole piece.
I was going to say, a lot of my friends that are writers and writing memoir material, they say things like, well, I have to get my daughter's permission or my sister's permission. And I don't know, there's a little part of me that always moves back when they say that. I maybe there's something missing in me, but I sort of feel like it's my story to tell. I'm telling it from my point of view, and I'm telling it from what's happening to me. Before my husband had dementia, and I did show him things I was writing. He's an ex-performer. He was an actor. He was always very like, wow, you're getting this published, or wow, and just happy for me. I don't think he ever responded, wait, that doesn't sound like me, or you're making me sound schmuck, so I don't know. I've never really felt, though, that I needed to get anyone's permission, and I might be wrong.
I mean, I think this is something that has been discussed a lot among memoirists, and not everybody feels it. And there was only one person I asked, the husband. There's many people in the book that I didn't in my book. But what do you think, Eleanor?
I think this is one of the most difficult and heartrending issues for me as a memoirist, because I really strive to be honest, but I loved what Sabina said, and that's the headline I would put underneath this. You need to let the love shine through. And so when I first started writing this new book, I read chapters aloud to my estranged husband, who was at that point still my husband. And he loved them. I mean, he laughed in the parts that were funny, and he even came to readings where I read from excerpts of the book. Now I don't have the option to ask him, really, because we are so estranged that we're not speaking, which feels really, really sad, but that's the way it is. And I also agree with Audrey. I don't feel like I need to ask permission. And I acknowledge in an author's note at the beginning of the book, there are going to be people who say, does she really have a right to tell the story of somebody who doesn't even have an autism diagnosis but has an autistic profile? Does she have a right to reveal all these intimate details about her marriage? And I acknowledge those concerns. It's not like I ignore them, but I'm trying to do something more. And that more is, I don't want to be disrespectful to my estranged husband or to myself, but I want to respect my own experience and what I've gleaned from it, and be able to share that with people, particularly other neurotypical women who find themselves perhaps with older mates who are undiagnosed and cannot understand what's happening to them and to their marriage. And I know that there are a lot of us out there. I know because I'm in support groups. I know because I've done a lot of research. And I really feel strongly, as I did with my first book, then I was speaking to bereaved parents when I wrote Swimming with Maya. And I had that same feeling of, yeah, this is pretty raw and I'm revealing a lot, but you know what? It's worth it, because here, world, here's my gift to you. it's this story. This is my gift. And I have to give it because that's who I am as a person and as a writer. So it's a tightrope, as Sabina was saying. I'm not trying to hurt anyone, but I am trying to tell the truth or the honest experience. Let's not say truth, the experience that I had as fully as I can.
Yeah, that's beautifully.
Relating to something Sabina said of letting the love shine through, I found, especially earlier in my writing, but still, a lot of times when I share stuff with my writing group, they say to me, okay, but what do you love about him? What did you ever like about him? You know, you're so angry now, you're so put upon, you're so disappointed. And me personally, I need to keep being reminded that I need to have that part of it too. I think just my personality, it's easier for me to get angry than soft. So yeah, I think it's really important that the love be in there. And it's, you know, I think for different writers, one thing is more challenging than the other. I'm good at anger.
But there's also love for yourself, Audrey. I think love for yourself in going through this, and compassion for yourself in going through this. You know, I think that's important as well. Well, another thing in memoir I think is really important is that the protagonist, usually the writer, is self-aware of one's own, to some extent, of one's own faults and what, you know, what you're learning. So I was writing about a person who was my political opposite, right? And I often thought I was right about my politics and he was wrong. And so when I'm writing my book, that was something that one of my writing group people had to say, is like, you have to stop writing. I mean, what did you learn? Be more humble. Like, what otherwise it would have been a terrible book. And I think it got so much better when I did that deep work.
Yeah.
Anyway, I don't know if that is.
Yeah.
I think that's a whole reason that readers are attracted to memoir often. You know, a good story, great writing, it's compelling, but they're coming there to learn something. And
Right.
so as a writer, then you need to be learning that same thing so that you can share it with them. And, you know, I had some comments from some people who said in my first memoir, oh, you were too hard on yourself. And I would think to myself, oh, no, you don't really know. I left stuff out. I wasn't too hard on myself. I mean, I think, again, like protecting the people, this is a balancing act. And absolutely, self-awareness is critical. When I'm reading memoir, I want the writer to be reflecting on her experience. I don't just want the raw experience.
Exactly. You're right.
I want the reflection. I want the so what. I want the, okay, this is how it changed me, or this is what I learned, or this is when I lost it and yelled at my husband. And I have a number of scenes in my book that are like that. I'm not trying to like paint myself as some kind of paragon of mental health, okay? I'm trying to show how two people can really struggle in a relationship. And God knows we struggled because we were speaking entirely different languages. And so it really forced me to look at how I communicate and the assumptions I make about how my neurotypical brain works and how my words are the right words, right? I really, really had to look at that. And I still am. I probably will be for years to come.
Right. Wow, that's really fascinating. Yeah.
And I think you have to be willing to do that hard work if you're going to write a memoir. Otherwise, it's pretty thin. You know?
Exactly.
And then, yeah, you have to have a taste for that kind of self-revelation on the page.
Right.
Well, and in fiction, it's often, you know, we talk about it as interiority. So in fiction, there is a similar requirement. It's just handled a little bit differently because you've got characters and more points of view. I mean, you could have a first-person narrator, but what Sabina read was very much showing things from the wife's point of view as a young woman, and then also including all three of the characters and blending them in a beautiful way. So
Right.
I'm interested to know, Sabina, what you think about all this.
Yeah. So that's the thing about the fairy tale, the fiction, the choice of fiction, and also the fairy tale aspect is there's a certain distance. And it's also something I learned, one of the things I learned when I was writing creative nonfiction is trying to write a memoir. So I have a half-finished memoir that I don't know when I'm going to go back to. But it's like there's that character, your past self becomes a character and you become the narrator, the you that you are today. And so you go back and you're telling the story about yourself. And I feel like that if this story was from my perspective, I'm not sure how I would tell it, and if I can tell that story yet. So the way that I chose it, the fiction and the perspectives changing, first of all, it allows for the fairy tale, because fairy tales are usually, omniscient. And it allows for us to get, for me, allows a reader to get into the different perspective and not just my singular perspective. Although the story is all my perspective, because I've chosen the particular scenes to create this romantic image of my parents, but there are a lot of scenes that can make my parents look very different. And so, like, again, whether it's a memoir or a fiction, you choose the scenes, you choose the stories that you want to tell, and ultimately the arc of the whole narrative and what story is being told at the end. So yeah, so I did a lot of thinking, and this was, like I said, initially a nonfiction, and then I turned it into a fiction.
Yeah, I was just thinking about how I wrote a memoir 15 years ago, and I'm writing fiction now, and I don't think I don't think I'm ever going to go back to memoir. There's just I don't know if it's, huh?
I said it's brave. It takes a lot of courage to write.
Yeah, it does take a lot of courage. It does take a lot of courage, and yeah.
I mean, part of the reason I'm writing the memoir material I'm writing is that I have found there aren't a lot of books, or there isn't a lot of material out there written for little old ladies like me. I mean, I'm 75, but I don't know. I smoke pot. I'm a bisexual. I mean, it's like, it's so limited what's out there. It's not my experience. So I want there to be something out there that people like me can relate to.
Right.
And not all old people are one way, of course. Seems obvious, but there's a standardness to writing for seniors that is really irritating.
Agree.
There are some exceptions, but in general,
No, it's awful.
pretty god
Especially
awful.
older women. Yeah.
Yeah.
And is there much about even just the situation you're in? I mean, I think I can totally see that. I mean, and I think there's a lot of people in your situation, but is there much written about it?
I think we're supposed to keep quiet and not complain too much. And, I don't know. I don't find stuff out there that's interesting to me very much.
I think that's really cool, Audrey. I think it needs to be done, and I salute you.
Yeah, I do too. And here, in terms of stereotypes and tropes about older women, I mean, that is something that I'm also doing in my work. I have explicit sex scenes, one in particular, Audrey, because you made me, you gave me feedback in one of the Grotto essay groups. You can't just leave that chapter there, Eleanor. You have to show us what happens. Oh God, so I did. But
sorry, or I'm glad I did.
Yeah, no, I think it improves the book, and I think it makes it more real. And I think, we don't talk about hard stuff about getting older. And that's what you're doing. And I think it's so brave and it's so necessary. Yeah, there may be textbooks and there may be how-to books. And, there's stuff, if you go on the Ethel or AARP, you see things about people who are caregivers, but it's not the same as a really well-crafted personal story. And that's what I felt about undiagnosed autism as well. There just aren't that many personal accounts that are written at a level that would be something that you'd really want to dive into and go, oh, wow, I didn't know that. Or, gosh, that rings a bell for me. You know, I don't know. I just felt it's so important to tell stories of being female at every stage, but I think especially as we get older. I could never have written this book when I was a young woman. There's no way. I did not have the self-awareness. I didn't have the life experience. I hadn't taken the risks, you know, that I took in this marriage. I took a big, big risk. And, you know, I think it's so important to tell those stories. So go you.
Go you and go Sabina. I mean, I think it's the particularity in all three of our stories that give them their power, the very specific details. I mean, Sabina's story is not just a fairy tale. It's a very particular story in a very particular place. You know, it's like we want good writing.
Right.
We want good writing.
But yeah, Sabina's story is called Fairy Tale, and I feel like fairy tale dances around or we're either writing sometimes in the spirit of a fairy tale or against a fairy tale, or like it's sort of like the spirit of fairy tale is kind of like always floating around writing about marriage. I don't know if you guys agree with that, but how did, if at all, did fairy tale like either piss you off or inspire you, or how was it part of your writing process or your thinking about marriage?
I mean, I think it sent me as a little girl in the wrong direction. I mean, the romance, you know, waiting for Prince Charming and all the cliches we've had to like sort of free ourselves with. To be married in the real world is nothing like what it's like in, you know, the Johnny Mathis songs I dance to in Japan. I mean, it's, you know, it's harsh. You know, there's a lot of beautiful moments with my husband, or else I wouldn't have married him, but it's harsh. You know, his illness is really harsh, but also I think just being married for a long time.
Yeah.
It's not an easy thing, I don't think, for anyone, at least no one that I know, I should say.
Well,
Is it
because
for
why
you?
is it? Because you get to know somebody very well, and that means that you know all their fault, or you know, a lot of their faults and all their warts, and you know, and I mean yours is sort of potentially extreme, but like gross things about them, and you know that, and then you maybe continue to love them, and that's interesting. I think that's a lot more interesting in some ways, although harder and harsher, as you say.
I think anytime you're writing about relationships in this culture, you're probably touching on fairy tale on some level, kind of that big cultural unconscious. It's all in there. And in my book at the beginning, I write about the Lone Ranger. That was kind of my fairy tale. The masked man who comes to carry me away. When I was a child growing up in a very dysfunctional household, I was waiting for the Lone Ranger. And it struck me later as I was writing this book, oh yeah, a masked man. Well, of course, I was going to fall for somebody who was masking.
That's
right. And, you know, having to let go of those things that I didn't even realize that was still affecting me. I didn't even realize how powerful that was. I thought I had worked through that. Well, guess what? No, not so much.
Right.
So I had another layer to work through. So I think fairy tales and, you know, romantic, I mean, growing up in the 50s and 60s, Johnny Mathis, I mean, I was so relating to that. I mean, Doris Day, Rock Hudson, I mean, think about the movies we saw. Think about the stories we read. You know, it's just, it's really inculcated in there. And it takes really a long time, if ever, to work your way all the way through that. Yeah. So I think it's an important consideration.
Why doesn't society prepare us for what's to come? What's the investment in keeping the fantasy going? I'm not sure, but the whole culture seems sort of invested in it. Advertising certainly about beauty and, I don't know, romance makes money. We need that diamond ring and we need that car and we need, yeah, I don't know. It's all.
But also I mean, I think it's about power and power over women. I mean, it's about women get married so they take care of the family, the dude, they have children. I mean, it's all, I mean, it's all part of that, I think. And then you're supposed to get married. Married is, you know, that's so important. That's who defines you, who you get married to. And then of course, don't talk about anything after the marriage. We don't talk about that. It's happily ever after. And yeah, so I think it's
If you don't get married, you're an old maid.
Oh my God,
or so cat lady.
Right. I just heard that
A childless cat lady.
Right.
Spinster it was a word that was about a woman that was so good at spinning thread that she was financially independent.
Oh, wow.
And
that's so interesting.
Became an epithet, you know, a negative connotation to be a spinster.
Or to be a blue stocking. I mean, what's wrong with being a blue stocking? It means you're an intellectual. It means you're an undesirable woman because you have so much going on upstairs that no man's going to want you. I mean, there's so many things like that. And honestly, we're in a moment right now, and it makes me very happy. There are some amazing novels and memoirs out there about marriage right now. So many good ones. Liars by Sarah Manguso, Blow Your House Down by Gina Frangelo, This American Ex-Wife by Lynn Lenz. I could go on and on. It just seems like there's a new one every day. I think, you know, there's a rising awareness among women of a certain age that marriage is not all it's cracked up to be. And we're talking about it very openly.
Which is why, yeah, some people want to bring it back in.
It was Vivian Gornick. I'm not sure, but I think it was Vivian Gornick who wrote a great essay called "The End of the Love Story" or "The End of the Story of Love." And she said that stories just have to be different now because love stories now can't just be moving towards when the people fall in love. It just doesn't work anymore.
Huh.
It's a really good essay.
Cool. I'll check that out.
Well, I was gonna say, like, I think because you guys are again telling your own stories. Mine is about my parents, but I think the fairy tale of my parents' story, even in real life, is that they did have like this kind of a relationship, but I don't know if I would say like love, like, but there was a friendship, and that in this world where you know, these types of men, I consider my father, I don't know if he'd like this term, but I think he's a feminist. And he like celebrated my mother and all of his daughters in a way that was very, you know, was very against not only where he was from, but here in America. And so for me, the fairy tale is, and I still believe in it, is the way that he and my mother's relationship was based on friendship. It was based on like a friendship, and it was like an understanding, and that I think did in some way set me up for the rest of my life. I was constantly looking for that, and I never saw it. You know, I don't think I've seen it in other places. I've seen it in very few places. I was married before my husband, so this is my second marriage. My first marriage was not like my parents, and that was such a disappointment because I did think everybody has this fairy tale. So it's so for me, this story that I'm telling, it's what all of you guys are saying. I agree with it, but I think with my parents' story, and it's a unique story, which is why I also wanted to preserve it in this way and writing the fairy tale. But my own life showed me that not all marriages are fairy tales. And my current marriage, I am happy to say that I feel like I learned from it to look for a friend and not somebody I loved or whatever that means.
Yeah.
And so for now, like, I don't know how the future looks, but we're okay for now. We're good. We love each other. And I hope that we have a fairy tale marriage too.
By the way, I haven't been following the chat particularly, but I did notice one comment that Beth made saying a really good point that fairy tales, like the actual Grimm fairy tales are more complex than, say, I may be kind of thinking of the Disney version when I characterize it as the happily ever after. So
Sophia, somebody asks, can you speak about turning memoir into fiction? What was that experience like? And I just want to say really briefly, I have done that. And sometimes, I mean, this is a pretty superficial level of it, but one thing it allows me to do is, if in real life there were 8 people at the vacation house, I can just make it 2 people. And so I don't have to have so many characters, and I edited out. I was just writing a story that takes place on a weekend away. And I made us just be away for one day. And so the time got really compressed and it really heightened the emotions. Whereas in reality, we were gone for 4 days and people got angry and then they made up. But I just wanted, so just in kind of ways like that, details, setting things, making something into fiction has given me a lot more freedom to play with the emotions and sort of shape them in a way that I wanted them to be shaped.
yeah, I can see that. Yeah. Well, shall we move into some of the questions from the audience? Michelle, are you muted?
I am, but now I'm not. There's a good one here from one of our audience members. Can you give examples of books by men on marriage that give an authentic and vulnerable take from their side? Are they similar in point of view and emotions than books by women? And if not, how do they differ?
Well, I can think of a few, but I'm not sure I can fully answer the question. I think of 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez, or Love in the Time of Cholera, also one of his books, which is more about a relationship, a marriage, and a love story that takes place after the people's original mates are gone. It's about a love story with very old people. And
Yeah.
I read it long, long ago. I can't really comment on the man's point of view in that one, but I also think of some of Jonathan Franzen's books that are more told from a male point of view. I mean, I think there are so many well-known male writers. Think of Henry Miller, for instance. I mean, who have written about women in ways that are kind of off-putting. But then I think we have a newer generation of men who are writing about women in a different way. And I'd be interested to know what other people think about that. I tend to read more books by women. I'm just going to be super honest here. I don't really care that much, honestly, what men are saying about marriage right now. I care passionately what women are saying. And not that I don't, I like certain male writers. I'm a devotee of Orhan Pamuk. I love his work, but mostly I read women. So I feel like I need somebody else to comment who's reading more men.
I like the short stories of Ryan Washington. He writes interestingly about his relationship with his partner or husband. I like Zach Williams, but like Eleanor, I mainly read, when I'm going to read fiction, especially, I just read books by women almost exclusively, not completely, but just about 90% of the time. And, you know, it started for me when I was in college. I was an English major. And I mean, I'm old, but so in the late 60s, in English departments in major universities, we were still reading 90% of books written by men. And it was hella frustrating. I mean, now, you know, certainly there are a lot more women in the canon, not as many as men, but I just, my whole life have been so hungry for books written by women and women's wanting to read women's experiences.
So I was gonna say that one of the books that comes to mind, and I really usually when it's a story about a woman, I like to read it by a woman. But Khalid Hosseini wrote A Thousand Splendid Suns, and he wrote like from the perspective of a woman in a way that I really it resonated. Like I felt like I believed that this woman would really feel like that. But again, what I didn't like was that the women were still, there's, I don't know, victims or like the, their tragic lives. And that kind of story did bother me. And I feel like that's one thing. So I can't say that, I don't know. And he never talks about the emotions of the males or the vulnerability of the males. And I would like to see that. So while I did like his portrayal of Mariam in A Thousand Splendid Suns, I wish he'd written more about the husband and his vulnerability. So that's what I have to say about that. Yeah.
There's less Andrew Sean Greer's book. I don't know if they're married
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
the book.
And he's,
But
yeah,
I think there's certain vulnerability there.
Oh yeah, and I actually love him. And he does write, he writes in such an engaging way
Yeah.
about the main character, about Les, about his own foibles, and about relationships, and about fantasies. I mean, talk about fairy tales, he's
Yeah.
always wanting things to be a certain way, and then reality intrudes, and it's usually funny and a little bit painful.
Right.
I like him too.
Any other thoughts from
Well,
books?
I'll ask the library question, because we're always looking for more book recommendations. So who does it well, or who is your writing inspired by?
I just thought of another man I want to mention. I just glanced at my bookshelves, I kind of go blank. Pico Iyer. I love Pico Iyer's writing. Now, it's nonfiction and it's often themed around travel, but I think he writes brilliantly about women. And his book, Autumn Light, is largely about his wife, who happens to be Japanese, and it's fascinating. I loved hearing his kind of interpretation of her perspective and her daily life and their marriage. So there's a man who I read.
Nice.
I actually like Paul Yoon. He wrote Snow Hunters. His books, I think he writes, there's a certain vulnerability to his male, his protagonist. He writes about males usually, but yeah, I love Paul Yoon.
Also, I guess I'd put in a word for male poets. I think some things get revealed in poetry that are not really addressed. At least I haven't seen them addressed quite as much in fiction or nonfiction. But there's some, like I think about Robert Haas.
Yeah.
He writes about love in some really great ways. Robert Pinsky. I mean,
Because you have to be interior in poetry.
correct.
That's a really good point. I mean, the point of poetry kind of is interiority. So,
Right.
yeah.
And in that way, memoir is a lot like poetry.
Yeah.
I think it's closer to poetry than it is to fiction.
Interesting.
Never thought of it that way.
Yeah. Which is why I sometimes write poetry instead of writing essays.
Right. A good way to, yeah.
I used to do that. Haven't done it in years. Sigh.
I mean,
Maybe one day.
there are a lot of male writers I've loved over the years who wrote fiction in the future that's based in the future. And I think a lot of men have had interesting ideas about that. I can't think of his name. Maybe it will come to me. But I mean, starting when I was, a kid, I loved 1984 and Brave New World and that kind of re-seeing the world or commenting on the world in that kind of way. So there's still some men writing like that I like, but if I want to read about what someone's feeling, I don't usually go to
Or turn to men. You brought up something that, well, I interpreted what you said, Sabina, in a particular way about poetry. Sometimes you write poetry instead of, and I thought that then I was just thinking poetry could be a way into writing a personal essay, or you could just write poetry, obviously. But that made me wonder about your process. When you get started on a piece, or how do you get from raw to, or how do you even start when you're thinking about, what are some of the seeds that started like your scenes, Eleanor? I know you did I think, is it 30 or 13 little short stories in the book? Or
There's
like
31 really
31.
short chapters. Yeah.
Okay, how did you pick those, and like how do you begin?
Oh, why don't we let Sabina answer?
Sure.
Uh, so I choose poetry instead of essays and those things that I really don't want to. So, okay, so this is complicated. Poetry for me is like you take a big idea and you distill it and you write it in short form.
Okay.
And then you edit it and you keep it short.
Okay.
Essay is when you take that idea and you start to pull it out, you add scenes, you add, thoughts. So recently I wrote a poem about my son, and then I was with at a writing retreat, and my friends all said, you need to turn that into an essay. So now I'm turning that into an essay because I know that there is more to tell beyond the poem. So if I think the poem is all encompassing and it's done, I won't turn that into an essay, but there are certain poems that I know that I can dig deeper and that
Okay.
there's a larger story to tell. And those are the ones that I turn into essays.
Okay, and then how do you turn them into an essay?
Okay, so then what I do is I go through it and then so if I was writing about a certain behavior my son has, or I was writing about his cat who follows me around, and that was the poem. And I talked about how he dresses. He likes to dress in a button-up shirt and a V-neck sweater and slacks, and he doesn't go to private school. That's just and so when I wrote that, that's one of the things I wanted to go back into, like when did he start doing this, and how do people react? Because I just wrote that as one line, and
Yeah.
so I just take those lines that I know I can pull and write more into and give the reader more, more about the character, the story that I'm telling. I just work on those as scenes or just explanations. And then I go back and then I edit it again and sculpt.
Right. Yeah. That
Mhm.
sounds, oh, that's really interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, I think my process is a little bit similar, although it's not necessarily coming from a poem. It might be coming from just a line or an image,
Mhm.
or oftentimes I start with dialogue. Something somebody says, and that's the basis of a scene, and then you kind of blow that scene out. And over time, this is what I like about writing long. I like to write long. So it takes on a shape. Go back to the bread metaphor, okay? You're kneading it, and as you're kneading it, you can feel what the material needs, okay? And so you start building it up, you start shaping it. And as you accumulate chapters, in this case of the 31 chapters, as I accumulated chapters, then it became more clear, okay, then this needs to happen.
Right.
I need
For
to
the arc,
focus.
kind of.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. And each chapter has an arc. If I'm really
Right.
on my game, each chapter has an arc. And when you get to the end of that little chunk, you want to go on to read the next little chunk, right?
Gotcha. Yeah.
So it is like kneading bread. I mean, you are working the material. And then a funny thing happens because the material starts working me. And then I start thinking, oh, wait, I left that out. And in this book, I have 5 separate little sections called What I Left Out. So I realized, oh, I'm leaving a bunch of stuff out. And I don't have room to put it all in. Vine Leaves Press publishes books of a certain length. They don't want it much longer than 50,000 words. That's short for a memoir. Usually they're 70 to 90,000, okay? So I had these things and I'm realizing, oh man, that's really important. That needs to be in there. So I have these lists of things I left out sprinkled throughout the book because there's not room for them. And actually, in the end, I feel like it made it a better book because it's more taught. You're going through it at a pace because I'm not telling you everything. And then all of a sudden I'll stop and I'll say, oh, whoops, I forgot to tell you this.
But so when you say you have the lists in the book, then you're not doing the whole scene. You're just sort of saying this thing happened, this thing happened that I haven't gone into. Is that what you're saying?
I'm writing a paragraph and I'm telling you the thing, almost like a little mini scene, or
Yeah.
sometimes it's just explication. It's not always a scene.
Yeah.
But I thought some of those, it totally surprised me when I was doing it, because I thought some of those were the most powerful things in the book. It's like a little secret I'm telling you, but I'm not going to tell you the whole thing.
Interesting.
It
Oh, I
sounds,
can't wait to
it
read
sounds
it.
like it must add really nice texture to the book to have
Yeah.
the different length. Like I'm intrigued. I want to see
I'm
that.
intrigued too.
Well,
Yeah.
I hope it works. I think it works. You know, you never know. It's your own work. You can't be completely objective, but I liked it. It was
Yeah.
fun.
You know, I find when I write, I often don't know at the beginning if it's going to be a short story or an essay, and I just start writing. And very often the material tells me what it wants to be. And I usually stick with the form that it came out in. Once in a while, I go, well, this is too distant. I'm going to make this an essay, or I'm going to, I don't know. But
What do
often
you
the
mean, though,
material
that-
tells me.
how does it tell you?
I don't know. I don't quite understand it, but I sit down and I start writing, and it's either I got up and asked Jerry to stop doing that, or Susan kicked Larry in the shin and said, "You're really annoying me." I don't know how it happens. It just presents itself.
So it starts to flow out of you and
Yeah.
reveal itself in a way.
Yeah. I don't know if it always reveals itself correctly, but
You're right.
very often I find I stick to
Interesting.
first kind of
That's really good.
outpouring.
Okay. I don't know if there's are there any other questions, Michelle?
No more questions coming through. So maybe final
Alright.
thoughts of what you wish you'd said.
Yeah.
Those stories.
Well, I'll begin. I mean, there still is, and this says more about me as a person, perhaps, than about writing. But, there's a little part of me that worries that when my book comes out, people are going to think I'm a creep and that I reveal too much and I wasn't respectful enough. And actually, when I've had things published in places where people can comment, the only negative comments I've got have been from men. And they've said things like, did her husband know what she was writing? Or, they're really, Sophia, you were bringing that up. There really still is that out there among some people.
Yeah.
And, I say very easily, I don't care. I don't need anyone's permission. But, I don't want to come across like some horrible person and some disrespectful person. But so I worry a little, but I'm also excited in doing this work, and it seems like it's helping me. I feel hesitant to say that too, because it was so ingrained in me that writing shouldn't be therapy, but it really has helped me deal with some really enormous challenges in the last 10 years regarding my husband's deteriorating health. And
Yeah.
so I'm grateful for it. I'm grateful for it.
I just want to say that worry, I think, in a weird way, means you're on the right track, because you want to be the right kind of part of that tightrope, or you're on the tightrope. Because if you felt you're writing a memoir and you're like, oh, it's going to be fine, no problem, nobody's going to criticize me, it's not going to be a good memoir, right? I mean, I think that's a pretty good sign that it's, you have to bring that human complexity to it. And, honestly, that might be why I'm hesitant to write memoir anymore, but it's just part of it. Even though I think now I would be much better about that stuff. I mean, I wouldn't care as much as an older woman. So I say go for it. And there will be people who criticize, and whatever.
I was gonna say, Audrey, I think earlier Sophia said something that was really beautiful, is you have compassion for yourself, and you should have compassion for yourself. And that I think when we're writing stories, even if they're fiction, it's really hard to find that balance of being authentic and then worrying about how the world will view that and caring about that. And so I feel like if we're so worried about what the world is thinking, the stories we tell won't resonate with other people, because you can feel that there's some sort of a layer between the writer and their work. And I think that you not having that will shine through and make that story compelling. And that's something that I struggle with too. And I think part of the reason I shy away from creative nonfiction is a lot of the stuff I write about is heavy. So that's one thing. I'm just too close and I need distance. And sometimes fictionalizing helps me write it. The second thing is that that there are things that I'm still worried about. And I feel like for me, I don't want to write it if it's not authentic. So I don't write it. And that's why I'm not writing a lot of the creative nonfiction. I'm just sticking to fiction until I'm at that place where I no longer care.
Someone just asked in the chat if we have a specific audience in mind when we're writing. So as my final thought, maybe I'll take a stab at that question. I do. I have a kind of ideal reader kind of perched on my shoulder, and she's a woman much like Audrey, much like Sophia, much like Sabina. That's my audience. And honestly, if men dig the work, I'm happy. And I know that some do, because I hear from them about Swimming with Maya, my previous book. But I'm really writing for women of a certain age. And it helps to have somebody in mind, I think. It helps me with the worry, Audrey, because I have all those same worries. I mean, I go through the tortures of the damned before a book comes out, and it's already starting. And my book is how many, 2.5 months away. And I'm already like waking up in the night going, oh my God, what did I say? Oh, but in the end, I think knowing that you're writing for a real person who's really going to be touched by your words is so important, because it helps with the worry. It's going to make a difference in people's lives. And so I just try to keep coming back to that. And also coming back to the recognition that being published is such an honor. I am so privileged to actually be able to put work out into the world. And so whenever I freak out and get scared, I just remind myself, oh, be grateful. You're giving this book to the world. So.
Yeah.
I think that's a good note to end on. Yeah, that's what our authentic writing about marriage is. It's a gift to the world, I think.
And
So,
I encourage you
and
all
to ourselves.
to look at the chat. You've really moved a lot of people in the audience tonight. So please do check that out. People really impressed. One final comment is that someone wrote in to tell us that they're writing a spicy chat book or maybe a memoir about the men in their life, and they're 87. So.
Oh, nice. I love it. I love it.
All right.
Buy that book.
Yeah, I'm interested in that book. Yeah, keep it posted.
All right. Again,
thank you, everyone. Thank you. It was wonderful. Thank you, Michelle. Thanks to the library, and thanks to the panelists.
Thank you. Sophia.
Yes.
Thanks to the audience.
Library.
Thanks, everyone.
thank you.
Thanks for coming.
Great.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.